Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in 2 minutes, so we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you, everyone, for coming back to a second part of our session with our friends over at Mass Creative. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Michael Ibrahim, and I'm Program Manager here at the Mass Cultural Council in our Cultural Investment Portfolio. And so, those of you who are here on today's webinar, you win the prize because today is our final webinar out of 45 webinars we've done this whole spring on helping organizations come out of COVID-19 and their recovery and rebuilding. And we've been doing this since January. So today is our final webinar. All of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel, of course, and we're actually creating a little capacity building toolkit on our website that you'll get access to in the weeks ahead as we pull all these presentations and videos and workbooks and handouts and everything together. So be on the lookout for that. But you've made it to the final here, whether you've attended any webinars, but you're here for us at the very end. Joining us today are our friends at Mass Creative, Emily Ruddick and G. Quach. We're going to get started in just a moment. If you want to say hi in the chat, just say your name and the organization, or if you're an individual just here to learn about advocacy, just give us a little wave. It's nice to know who's here. This session does have automatic captioning. So if you have attended webinars or meetings with Mass Cultural Council this past spring, this is something that that we do on all of those sessions. So if you would like to access those, there's some options at the bottom of Zoom, depending on which version of Zoom you have. If you find this annoying, you can always minimize that in the hide subtitles section of Zoom. It's all at the bottom there for you. We will have time for conversation today because advocacy is all about conversation. So we ask you to please use the Q&A function that helps us organize things a little bit. And also, if you want to remain anonymous with your question, the Q&A function is a wonderful way to go about doing that. Also, I'm sure Emily and G will be looking at the chat too, in case you want to put something in there. This session is being recorded just like our session last week. So you'll get an email from me when this recording is all available. And you can just always bookmark Mass Cultural Council YouTube channel, and that's where we all put everything there. I have just put the link to today's session. We've got the slides if you'd like to follow along at home. I'll repost those for those who've joined us since I posted that. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Emily and G.
Hello, all.
Hi. Thank you, Michael. I'm Emily.
And G.
And we are part of the Mass Creative team, and we are beyond thrilled to be wrapping up this long series. We hope actually that all of the things that you've learned, the different webinars that you've attended or materials that you've received, like we can in some ways sort of think about like, well, what's next, right? Like our work continues. And the lessons that we learned from the pandemic, at least from our vantage point, is that there is a ton of energy and passion and connections being made about how within the creative sector, we need to really effectively advocate for the things that we need so that when calamity strikes, we have allies in elected positions and in decision-making positions who understand our issues and are ready to make sure that we are caught, right? So that's what we're really going to be talking about today. We're going to go through some very specific policy legal pieces. And then we're going to talk more, we're going to do some brainstorming, and we're going to take you through a little exercise to help you think about how you can really connect with someone you're trying to advocate or work with or build community with. So there's going to be a lot. I also want to just acknowledge, and we at Mass Creative acknowledge, that when we're talking about policy, whether it be laws that are passed, rulings, judicial rulings that are being made, or the implementation of policy, we are talking about a history where individuals and communities have been marginalized, and in fact, violence has been perpetrated on them by some of these policies. And so today we may be talking about things that are sensitive, related to how policy impacts literally one's life. And so we want to acknowledge that. And the work at Mass Creative is about making sure that when policy is set, folks from historically marginalized and minoritized communities have seats at the table and their interests are heard, so that they are not, that harm is not continually perpetuated. So with that said, let's get rolling. I'm going to talk first about so we talked last week about what is advocacy, right? We decided it's like asking for what you need. So we're going to talk today specifically about policy advocacy. And for us at Mass Creative, we break this up into sort of 4 main types. So the first part is research. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last year is how important data and research has been to making our case effectively, right? So every time you agreed to participate in one of the surveys that the Mass Cultural Council put out about what the impact of the COVID pandemic and necessary public health closures were, you were participating in data collection that was part of research that helped with our advocacy, right? We were able to tell the super clear data-driven story about what the losses have been to the sector and what's needed to help us get reopened and restarted. Then we talk about public education. So how do we make sure that it's not just the executive director of an organization or the executive director of Mass Creative talking about the importance of arts and culture for everyone in the Commonwealth? How do we educate our community, our subscribers, our patrons, our networks, our friends and family around the issues that affect arts and culture in Massachusetts? Then we also can educate lawmakers, right? We can share with them what has happened to us. You know, it's really impactful when you have that data report from the Mass Cultural Council and you send a note to your legislator and say, hey, I'm an artist living in Salem, Mass, and I lost all of my income in the last year. And that's been really scary. And I'm really interested in knowing what you're thinking about doing to make sure that the arts and culture return at the end of all of this. That's a piece of education and advocacy, right, to an elected official. Then there's the work of voting education, right? So, and we saw that happen a ton in the last election in November in 2020, right? A lot of making sure that voters understood what was at stake in the election, what candidates' positions were on different issues, and encouraging people to vote, right? Like there were major voter turnouts, campaigns that were happening to make sure that as many people voted and as many people understood the different ways that you could vote in the last election. And then finally, there's lobbying. And so this is like support for or against a specific piece of legislation, a specific policy decision, or a specific way that policy is going to be implemented. So what I want to show a little bit in this slide is that there is a lot that goes into the common phrase of advocacy, and only one of those types is lobbying. And I bring this up because I know that oftentimes when I talk to leaders of arts and cultural organizations or even staff members, they go, "Ooh, we can't do that. We're a 501c3. We're not allowed to lobby. We're not allowed to get involved in any of that. Our board really gets upset when we get involved." And I'm here today to tell you that maybe your board gets upset, but they're getting upset for the wrong reasons. 501c3s are very much allowed to advocate for the things that that affect their organization and affect their communities. And in fact, they're even allowed to lobby. So let's dig into the do's and don'ts. And I'm going to put in the chat You don't have to follow along, but these are a number of resources from our friends at Boulder Advocacy, which is one of my favorite organizations. Their work really is about helping 501c3s understand and demystify what lobbying is and how to do it. So there's a bunch of links. I would suggest copying and pasting into your browser, and you can look at them at your leisure afterwards. But first, we're going to start actually not with 501c3s or organizations. We're going to start with you, the individual. So as an individual, as a citizen and a resident of Massachusetts in the United States, here are things you can absolutely do as much of as you desire. So first, you can directly lobby your elected officials. You can send a note to your state rep and say, I absolutely love arts and culture in Massachusetts, and I really want you to support Bill 1234 that would make sure that every arts organization in Massachusetts received at least $20 million every year, right? That would be a very interesting piece of legislation, but you can do that. You cited the bill that you're supporting because, again, it's specific legislation. You said why, and as a private individual resident and citizen, you are absolutely allowed to do that. You can also do grassroots lobbying. You can send a note to your friends and family and say, I just told my state rep how much I believe in this piece of legislation, and I think it would be a good idea if you did the same, right? And so you can do that. And then you can get involved in elections and campaigns, right? You can go to coffee hours with candidates and let them know how important you believe arts and culture is to the future of Massachusetts and its recovery, right? You can support or oppose a candidate. You can volunteer for a candidate's campaign. You can register voters. You can encourage citizens to vote. You can do all of that as much as you like as an individual citizen and resident of the United States and of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So here's what gets interesting, right? There are limits around what you can do, what your nonprofit organization can do. And I'm talking really specifically about 501c3s, which are nonprofit organizations that are allowed to accept donations, charitable donations, and those donations those folks can receive a tax deduction for those charitable donations, right? So it's a very specific type of 501 in the IRS tax code, and it's all built out of the IRS tax code, right? And so they have limits. They say that, like, if you're going to receive donations, your work is really about taking care of communities and supporting individuals and people through your larger public good work. And your job is not to be like spending all of your time lobbying for a specific issue or a specific piece of legislation. And so they've put some guardrails on all of this. So as you can see in the slide, a nonprofit organization can do some direct lobbying. And we'll get in a second, you'll see another slide that kind of unpacks that a little bit more. So a nonprofit, an executive director or the head of government affairs, or even the communications manager, on staff can write a letter to a legislator and say, Mass Creative really wants to urge you to support Bill 12345. Here are the reasons. You can actually show up and testify for a bill that's getting a hearing. We talked about that last week, about how as part of a bill becomes a law, it gets a hearing. So your organization can go in and say, we do not support Bill 12345. We don't think every arts and cultural organization should get 20 million. They should get 50 million every year, right? You can do that if you want. And then you can also urge your network, your audience, everybody who's in your email list. You can let them know about a piece of legislation that's important to you, to them, right? And this doesn't even have to just be about arts, right? So say you are, say you're an arts education organization, right? And your work is about making sure that young people have access to arts education, and you provide after school art classes to every kid in a city or town, right? And there's a piece of legislation that would affect how young people are allowed to spend their after school time, right? And maybe it doesn't even say like, yes, they can do arts or no, but it just really affects the population you're working with. You as a nonprofit organization can directly lobby around a piece of legislation that affects the community that you serve, right? And then finally, you can do advocacy within elections. So that means you can educate candidates and voters on the issues. And you can do that through fact sheets. You can do it through questionnaires and forums. You can also do partisan really clearly. So that means you can do voter registration or voter turnout that does not endorse one or two, or it does not endorse any candidates. And you can also encourage citizens to vote. So for example, you can send an email out to your entire, subscriber list that says, next Tuesday is election day. Have you checked and looked up where your polling location is? It's really important to take, to participate in democracy. And as a civic organization in the town of Lexington, we want to make sure everybody who works with our symphony and enjoys our music also is a proud voter, right? But what you can't do is you can't write a note, and we think you should vote for candidate XYZ because she's the best person for the arts. You can't do that. You can just encourage them to vote, and you can encourage them to register to vote. All right. Next, so as you saw on that other slide, right, I said that you could do direct or grassroots lobbying as a 501c3, and there was like a nice little asterisk there, and that's because there are limits. So literally in the IRS code, it says no substantial part of a nonprofit's activities can be used to influence legislation. And then you see on my slide, it says, what's insubstantial? Well, funnily enough, the IRS declined to actually say exactly what substantial versus insubstantial actually means. So the guide rule is you want to keep it between 3 to 5% of overall activities. So of the 100 emails, I'm going to do this. No, if you send 100 emails, I'm trying to make sure I'm doing my math correctly. If you send 100 emails a year, you want to make sure that no more than 3 to 5 of those emails are related to direct lobbying messaging, right? I think I've got my percentages down. Somebody check me in the chat or the Q&A if I'm wrong. But basically, and that's right, like that's a way to gauge it, right? You want to make sure that your staff isn't spending more than 3 to 5% of their time directly lobbying a legislator or working to, do grassroots lobbying work, right? But again, those are really specific things. So you can send as many emails as you want, talking about the importance of access for everyone in the Commonwealth to arts and cultural experiences. You can say how important it is that young people have arts in their classroom, right? But what I didn't say is this specific bill or this specific, we need to make sure that Governor Baker does X, Y, and Z. What I'm saying is you can do as unlimited amount of advocacy education as you want to, okay? Next up, let's talk a little bit about nonprofits and elections, because there are more guide rails there, or I keep saying guide, I mean guardrails, right? So here are some things that a nonprofit absolutely cannot do. So Mass Creative is a 501c3, and we will never send out a communication saying we formally endorse G. Quach to run in his run for state representative. We'll never do that. We think he's a great person, but we're never going to send out a formal endorsement. We're never going to make a direct campaign contribution to G's campaign or to my campaign or to anyone's campaign, right? And that's not just about financial, that's also about in kind. So we're never going to host a fundraiser for a candidate. We're never going to, we're not paying the candidate, but we're never gonna like in kind give them their space. We're never going to, as an in kind donation of services, like agree to review their policy platforms and make edits and changes or write their policy platform. We're not going to do that. We're also never going to ask a candidate to sign a pledge on any issue. And you can see the example, right? We're never going to say like, will you agree or not agree that once you're in office, you're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? And then we're also never going to like explicitly publish or share information that makes it look like we're favoring one candidate over another. So we release candidate questionnaires all the time, and they're the same questions for every candidate. But when we share those candidate questionnaires, we share them so that they look absolutely, exactly alike. We don't say that, candidate one, we don't put in big, bold letters that, that are triple the size font that they support, increased support for arts education for every student, and then put on, draw a big arrow on the other candidate's sheet that says they don't support it, right? They have to look the same, and we have to be, it's about providing voter education materials that help voters make informed choices, okay? So as you can see, although I am not getting any sort of kickback, I promise you, or commission from Boulder Advocacy, we think they're a great resource and we totally encourage you to check them out. I am going to take a beat because that was a lot of information, and I'm gonna just ask if anyone has any questions at this point, because we rocketed through a lot of info. You can ask any questions your heart desires. I'm feeling very good about my my ability to explain these topics. So if based on the fact that there are no questions, so I'm going to continue. But if you at any point have a question, feel free to use the Q&A. We are excited to see what your thoughts are and what your questions are. So I'm going to move on to sort of the next piece of this, right? Like, so now you know what you can and can't do, both as an individual resident in the Commonwealth, as well as what you can do when you're working or leading an arts and cultural organization. So I'm going to like flip the script a little bit, and I'm going to ask a question because we're going to talk about building your public narrative. So here's my question, which is, why do we tell stories? Feel free to use the chat to answer the question. I'm hoping we can get a couple of folks to answer. Another way to think of this is there an example in your life where you can think about how a story or someone telling you a story changed your behavior or influenced your decision making? So, okay. Oh, look, you're here. Okay. So to bring data to life, says Maria, to teach and reinforce cultural norms and values. Yeah, that's a good one. To make information more interesting. Thank you. Yeah, those are all really good reasons. I have to share the problems of our society and what we are doing about it. Yep, I love it. I love it. I have a 4-year-old, and throughout her 4 years of existence, I have used stories to help her think about things like not touching a hot stove, or why it's important for her to take medicine, right? When she's sick. And G says to move people. Yeah. So stories are super, super powerful. I'm also just going to share a personal example. I have, for my entire life, loved Star Wars. I saw it at an early age. It connected with me. It got me excited. It made me think about what I could do, not just as like a Sleeping Beauty princess, but like as the princess of a rebel alliance. It made me think about how like governments can influence and like harm people. It also made me think about family relationships, lots and lots of things. Big Star Wars fan, right? And the Star Wars story is like straight out of like the perfect hero quest journey, right? And, I'm sure many of you know that Joseph Campbell, who wrote about the hero quest, often used Star Wars as an example. So why I'm bringing this up is that stories have a natural flow, and stories are more exciting when there's a main character. So, for what it's worth, whatever your opinion is, like Luke Skywalker is the protagonist of Star Wars: A New Hope. We start out with him on a farm. He is like living his life with his uncle and aunt. He's worried about like getting droids to the Tashi station. He's like, just wants to like get off the rock, right? And he's our hero. And then what happens, right? He encounters 2 droids, and they belong to like a weird hermit who lives nearby, who is a guy named Obi-Wan Kenobi. And Obi-Wan Kenobi teaches him about the Force, and he goes on the Millennium Falcon. And through learning about the Force and like learning about like his history, he challenges and he like is a fighter pilot, and then he like explodes a Death Star, right, with his friends. Like he joins the Rebel Alliance, right? And he's changed through that experience. And at the end of that movie, when he's standing and he's at the medal ceremony, he's like a different person. He is more empowered. He is like connected to a community. He's stronger. He understands himself better. All of those things through that experience, right? Again, I really hope that I'm not spoiling Star Wars for anyone on this webinar. But that's why I'm talking about this is like, that story has an arc. There's a protagonist who runs into an obstacle. They have a mentor who like helps them understand how to overcome that obstacle. They do that. And at the end of the story, they're a different person. And this matters because those are the stories, whether it's Star Wars or whether it's, any other work of fiction or myth or biography, right? They inspire us. They help us to understand issues better, to move people, right? Because we can identify with that protagonist and we can go on that journey with that hero. And so the reason I'm talking about all of this is that there's a way to build your own public narrative story that when matched with data, as a couple of the folks in the chat have, oh, John, I'm so sorry. I hope I haven't ruined Star Wars for you. I won't even tell you what happens in the second movie. But when you marry that story, that really powerful, connected personal story with data, it makes you so effective as an advocate. And Mass Creative didn't come up with this. Emily Reddick didn't come up with this. There's actually a really fantastic individual, Marshall Gantz, who really started to think about how to build public narratives. And he was inspired by a lot of traditions, a lot of storytelling traditions, a lot of actually Judaism and Jewish storytelling traditions to put together these three tenets: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. Right? So we tell the story of us, like to center us in our work and help us build relationships. And then we tell the story of us, story of self. Then we tell the story of us, which is about how we come together, how we are connected, and how we are more powerful as a coalition or as a sector or as a community. And then the story of now is really about why is it important and urgent that it's happening right now? So it's, going back to that Star Wars, like the Death Star is about to take out the whole Rebel Alliance. Like Luke can't wait to join. Han, comes back because it's so urgent. He's got to be a part of the good fight together, right? Or he's got to be a part of the larger community to change things, okay? So here's a little way that we think about how to write that narrative story, okay? So here's the next slide. And this is, feel free to write this down. This is like the quick cheat sheet for it, but so you can see like these are the prompts. Before I was, then I was, now I am, I believe. And I should add, I believe that, right? So here's how I tell my story of self. So when I was growing up, I was kind of shy. I tried to wait in the back. I didn't like to be the first one out to do something. I like to observe and see what was happening. And then my mom enrolled me in a theater class. Specifically a theater class at Harwich Junior Theater in Harwich, Massachusetts. And I learned how to be with kids my own age. I'm an only child, right? I also, I learned about improv, and I had this great teacher, Nina, who kind of helped break it down for me and helped me discover that the creative ideas that I had in my head, I could share them with my other classmates, with my friends in class, and we could create a whole nother story that had never been told before. And I went on in my life, right? I did theater in high school, and I can still tell you, I can still viscerally remember the feeling when I stood on stage and I delivered a line during a school performance, and my peers laughed, and it was a comedy, I promise you. They laughed and I felt understood. And that was so powerful for me. It like propelled me in my career. I went to work in theater. I went to be with other people who love to tell stories, who love to help people understand themselves better, right? And I got really confident. I learned how to speak in public. I learned that my ideas, I didn't have to wait to tell my ideas. I could share my ideas. And now I work in public policy because I believe that everyone should have the benefits that come with creative expression and cultural participation, whether they are a young person who's, learning to overcome their shyness by being in a theater class, or there's someone who through a public mural that includes part of their cultures and traditions feels more connected and accepted in their downtowns or their community. Like, that's the power of arts and culture. And that's why I think it is so important that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts increases the amount of public support it provides every year to arts and cultural organizations and to individual artists. Okay, so that's my story. That's my public narrative. So you heard about who I was before, then what happened, now what I'm doing, how it's changed me, and what I believe. Okay, and so when I go in and talk to legislators, I do often use that story. When I talk to other arts advocates, I use that story because what I'm trying to do is help build our larger community of advocacy and convince people that's not because I show up at the State House and tell the story, it's because all of us show up at the State House and tell our story, or to our town halls or our city halls, right? So that's a little bit about, so that's the public narrative piece. So I'm going to take a beat and I am going to pause not only for questions, but I'm wondering if someone or someones might like to try to take a crack at that public narrative. And what I'll do is I'm going to switch back to the older slide. And if you would just want to take a minute or two and think about how, and then enter into the chat the before I was, then I, now I am, I believe. I'd love to be able to just hear some of your stories. It doesn't have to be as complex as mine. You can even shorten it. Doesn't even have to be about arts and culture. Anything that you really care about and how you can connect it to your own personal journey. I'm assuming you all are writing really wonderfully detailed public narrative stories. If you haven't, or you've decided not to do that, if you have any questions, I'd love to take some now at this point about any of the things we've talked about. Okay, I hope you might consider continuing to work a little bit on your public narrative story, but I'm going to turn it over to G. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry, John, I'm trying to write a story that can be created as an art exhibit like theater does. Oh yeah, that's interesting. I think that would be fantastic. I don't know. I think this like public narrative is like ripe for an interactive art experience or theater performance, right? So John, let's continue to talk about that because I think we could do that together. But I'm going to turn it over to G now because now you know what you can and can't do. Now you've got some tools to think about to do that advocacy, but let's talk about how we actually do that advocacy and what are the opportunities.
Thanks, Emily. So opportunities to advocate. And before I get started, friendly reminder that Mass Creative believes advocacy should be a part of every org and director's work. We are not saying that you have to add it on top of all the stuff you have to do. We understand everybody's already stretched, but we do believe the benefits of advocacy in the long run is worth the time invested in it. And so we would hope that you place advocacy on the same page as programming and fundraising. So let's get started. How can we engage? First way we can engage is support what's already out there. So what's out there? To find out what's out there, there's a couple of easy ways. One is just to sign up for Mass Creative's email or attend one of Mass Creative's bi-weekly webinars. During this, it's only 15 minutes on a Friday, and Emily goes through all the legislation and related things that will impact the creative sector. So that is a very easy way to know what's going on and to support work that's out there, because Emily has brought it all together for you. For example, we know each year we're going to advocate for more resources in the state budget to the creative sector. That's a given. But in addition to that, last year, in all that craziness, we also had to make sure that different parts of our creative sector didn't fall through the cracks of aid and support. We have, for example, legislation on the table right now called S2246, which is asking the state to put aside $200 million of the aid coming in from Washington towards specifically the recovery of the creative sector. There is also a commission that is happening right now who is being tasked to make recommendation on what this creative sector needs for recovery. So these are two examples of things that are going on that you could raise your voice to contribute to. So once again, to reiterate, sorry, supporting what's out there is what we believe the minimum thing you can do. And this extends past just the creative sector as well. The world is interrelated. So policies related to healthcare, housing, the public transit impact artists as well. So being aware of these things and supporting these things are important. So what do you do with this information? Step one, share with your board members and your constituents. The more people that know what's going on, the more we can be on top of and encourage our lawmakers to enact policies that positively impact us. Two, engage with the material, not just say, okay, here's something that Mass Creative tweeted out, let me retweet it, but really engage with it, reframe it so that it has your org's perspective in there, because that will speak better to your constituents. So for example, when there's a bill that puts 200 million towards the creative sector, how does that directly impact you and your org? Explaining that to your constituents better increases their chances of participation. And then promote that through your social networks. Once again, we're saying the more people that are aware of all these policies in legislature, the more chances that we can have impact on it. And then additionally, all that good stuff Emily had mentioned earlier, develop relationships with your legislature, endorse certain policies and platforms, write letters, write thank yous. For example, the state Senate and the state House in their proposed budget included 20 million to the arts. And that was the number that we had been asking for. So instead of writing letters to say, please increase it, we can write letters to say, thank you for supporting us. So that's the first tier of engagement, which we think everybody should make a part of their regular work. In addition to that, we also think it would be beneficial to build networks and coalitions within your sector. Kind of move away from this deficit mentality where we're all fighting over these small pools of resources. You can see this model in other areas. Like we have Writers Guild, Carpenters Guilds. Save Mass Stages is an example of how many who worked in live venues and their needs were not being addressed during the pandemic. So they came together to advocate as a larger whole, not just as one venue. And they were able to get funding on a national level that's specifically named their sector for aid. This is a demonstration that networks and coalitions can have stronger voice and influence. They can better articulate the needs of the sector as a whole. They are less likely to fall into competition for minimum resources. They can begin to build relationships, trust, and a working model that is needed for sustained advocacy. I want to remind you that a lot of the things we want are not going to be achieved in one go. They can share best practices and learn from each other on what has worked and what needs to be improved. So I ask you this, are you already speaking with other orgs that do similar work as you? Are you having conversations about the needs you all share? Are you developing the work model that and trust needed to have effective advocacy? I hope you are. If you're not, please begin that process. And if you already are, please let us know, because the more we know about what the sector needs, the better we can advocate on your behalf when possible. So I want to transition to also this third level of engagement, which is thinking about and caring for the sector as a whole. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, as a creative community, we are so diverse. We have our education, we have professional artists, we have musicians, theater, visual artists, the dance. The list goes on and on and on. The more we are siloed, the weaker our power to affect change is. So we believe that being able to come together and have a shared vision of the whole is really important. And I'm going to be really honest. Some of the things that our sector needs require ongoing and sustained advocacy. And to shape that requires not just one action, but a multitude of actions that leads us towards that direction. I like to think of it in a similar way to, say, farming or growing a garden. We have to till the soil. We have to get rid of rocks and other impediments. We have to plant the seeds. We have to cultivate the fruit or plant or tree before we even get to the harvest of that bounty. So just to elaborate on that metaphor a little bit, tilling the soil. Does the creative sector right now have a culture of advocacy? So are things in place that is built in where it makes it easy for us to ask and connect with lawmakers to tell them what we need? Getting rid of rocks and other impediments. Are there barriers for engagement by everyone? So one of our core beliefs is that equity needs to be centered in our advocacy, because without that equity piece, it is not sustainable. Our work has to benefit everyone so that everyone should and can participate. So being aware of the rocks and other impediments and removing them so that all can come to the table is really important. Planting seeds. What are little pieces of policy or action that we can fruit and put into the ground that can grow into fruit at a later date? So the jump from where we are now and where we want to be is not going to happen overnight. So being able to see the different steps along the way is really important. And to put that in a more concrete example, getting an elected official into office that prioritizes the arts is not enough. Which leads me to the next part of cultivating that, that fruit and plant. So we need to continue to work with them and to reshape the other pieces and continue to build and grow in that mode. So we are really specifically naming that we are not asking people to participate in one campaign, but to participate with us in a culture where we are continually asking and working with decision makers to build that vision of the creative sector that we see. So why go through all this trouble? I think I mentioned it earlier that a lot of the things we want cannot be done any other way. They are such large ideas that it requires all of us together to move that rock. So coming together at that level, we can have impact on a larger scale, which in turn makes our smaller specific work much easier. We will not be fighting a system that is against our work, but shaping the environment in which our work can thrive. Being in that network also, we are better to ensure the policy needs are uplifting everyone. And by that, I mean, advocacy for ourselves is important, but we also have to ensure that our advocacy for ourselves does not unintentionally negatively impact others. And the best way to ensure that is to be working with others towards that greater goal. So for example, space is an issue for artists. That's a given. But we do not want to be put in a situation where we're competing for space for artists with people who are competing space for green public areas, for public affordable housing, and other areas that require space as well. If we can work in conjunction with those other advocacy priorities, then we can find solutions that benefit us all. And we can only do that by coming together in that larger scale. If I can use a specific example that Mass Creative currently is working on, CTV Boston is the current iteration of advocacy coalition that was started in 2013. And what are we trying to do this time around specifically is work with other orgs in around Boston, because this current campaign is centered around the Boston mayoral race. And we are working with, together with other orgs to uplift the needs of every member of the sector while centering BIPOC and marginalized voices who have often been left out of the conversation, especially in the general pursuit of more resources. One of the fruits of this work that we've been doing has been the recent release policy platform that had input from many of Boston's diverse creative leaders, ranging from Dunamis, BAMFest, Edvestors, and the MFA. And though the current focus for us is in the Boston mayoral race, we are building a practice that we can extend to next year's gubernatorial race and further policies down the line. And we are having conversations with the candidates to be able to share the needs of the sector as represented in that platform. So you can see the beginning results of why that work matters and why your engagement in that work is so important. Because we don't want to speak, we cannot, number one, and we do not want to speak for all the different aspects of the creative sector. We need you to be in the room with us, to share with us, and to help shape what you need and what the solutions to those needs are. So I'm gonna stop there for now. I think back often that when we ask people to advocate, their mind instinctively jumps to lobbying. And we are definitely not asking everyone to lobby. That is not it at all. But What we are asking is that all members of the creative sector be willing and out there sharing what their needs are, what their community needs are, and helping shape that equitable creative community that we all want to see. Okay. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, G. I see that there's a question from John in the chat. John, I followed up just with a clarifying question, but so you say the theater example for the Boston City election works better for theater and dance. For visual arts, the goals of organizations are usually very different. Any example or any suggestions? G, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not 100% clear on what the question is.
So clarifying. So one org might say the need is for studios, while another would say we need good venues. Well, if I may, G, can I take a crack at this? Yeah. So in the development of the policy platform, people said both. And if you look at it, there is both. And I think that our sector is pretty broad and pretty large, and there are a lot of needs. And so, but there are a couple of like specific ones that I think we've all identified. The need for more financial resource, more public support that is channeled equitably, right? That it's not just about a few or one or two organizations, but really considering how to make sure that that money is distributed in a way that acknowledges and helps resource historically marginalized or minoritized organizations and communities, right? Like that's a piece of the work that we see and we're really kind of highlighting. The space conversation, whether it be studio space, space to create, space to present, or space to live. Those are all things that are incredibly important. And I think the issue is that we are talking about a lot of things at the same time, but we have, if you have a chance to go into that policy platform, you'll see that it's sort of boiled into three main categories: more city resources for a more equitable creative and cultural sector in Boston, making sure that every young person has access to quality arts education in schools, as well as creative youth development experiences outside of schools, and making sure that there's space, both, right, present, create, and live space for people in Boston. I'd also like to point out that this is actually a really interesting example, because when we were going through our policy needs for the coalition members in Boston, we also were able to identify some intersectional policy issues. So artists are facing displacement. So are many other people in the city of Boston. Artists are facing issues about the unaffordability of childcare. So are many other working parents in the city of Boston. Transportation is another issue that affects artists. And that is an issue for a lot of people who live in Boston. And so we also tried to make sure that those points were lifted up, and that we're looking and we're seeking to partner with housing coalition partners, with transportation advocates on that work. That's a part of like, how do we shape and care for the sector and community as a whole? Does that help? Does that answer the question somewhat?
And I would also add to that, this is why those different tiers of advocacy is so important. So if you're part of the theater, you can talk about the specific needs of the theater, including venue. But when it's about space, space impacts other members of your community, and you do not want to be siloed in your advocacy for space.
There's also a question in the Q&A, and I want us, there's a little bit more that we want to talk about. So I'm gonna try to answer very briefly, if that's okay, G, and then I'll move us on to the next sections. So the question is, I would be really curious to hear thoughts you have specifically about pilot and pilot related advocacy in arts and cultural sector. So just really briefly, pilot stands for payment in lieu of taxes. It is a policy theory that usually very large very large nonprofit organizations should voluntarily make payments to their city or municipality in order to offset the amount of city resources that they are currently using. And this is this also has to do with property taxes, right? So in the city of Boston, the main revenue driver for the city of Boston's public revenues is through real estate taxes. The taxes on property. And so if you're a nonprofit that owns land in the city of Boston, you're not paying property taxes because constitutionally nonprofits and through the IRS don't pay taxes, right? They're tax exempt. There's been a lot of, I think, some really good advocacy on the part of the organizations that are currently, the arts and cultural organizations that are currently engaged in pilot payments. And there's 7 organizations in the city of Boston. To be clear, there are also examples of, they're not quite so blatantly called pilot across Massachusetts, but efforts by cities and towns to figure out loopholes to charge nonprofits to add to city coffers. And I think that, so the position of those organizations that have been leading the advocacy is really about a fundamental misunderstanding of the contributions that arts and cultural nonprofits make to a city, a municipality, and to the Commonwealth, right? That they are providing some really specific community benefits, and which is why they're nonprofit organizations, and that that misunderstanding and misinformation about those community benefits and contributions to the city, that's a place for education. And so that is primarily an education advocacy campaign, right? About informing residents and stakeholders about the good work that nonprofit arts and cultural organizations are doing in any city or municipality across Massachusetts. So I'm going to move us on. I hope that helped give a little bit more clarity to that issue. So who are your elected officials? Who are these decision makers that we're trying to advocate and influence and educate? And so I have written out almost all of them that I could think of, right, that are our elected officials. So obviously we can start federally with our president, our president, our vice president. In Massachusetts, we elect 2 senators. We also elect 9 Congress people. We also elect a governor and a lieutenant governor and an attorney general and a state auditor, all those constitutional officers. We have 40 state senators. We have 160 state representatives. And then depending on where you live, you might have a direct elected mayor or city councilors or a select board. There's a lot of different configurations for how city and town government works. But all of these people are your elected officials. And all of them have different, I would say, purviews about what their responsibilities are. And so I just want to take a quick pause because Mass Creative is almost always focused on statewide or local policy making decisions. We do work in partnership with a number of organizations on federal issues, but the president of the United States is not going to be your most effective target for advocacy for more money being paid by the city of Pittsburgh to arts and cultural efforts, right? Because the president doesn't have anything to do with how the city of Pittsfield allocates its money. The city government of Pittsfield certainly does, and those are the folks that you would want to talk to. Similarly, our state legislature are the ones who are making the majority of decisions related to how our state budget runs and the way state funds are allocated. And so is the governor. The governor has enormous amount of flexibility with how money is spent in terms of state dollars. And so knowing who are the right folks to talk to about an issue is really key. The other piece to know is that oftentimes today's city councilor is tomorrow's congresswoman, which is exactly what happened with Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who's a former city councilor in Boston and is now a congressperson. Similarly, one of our U.S. senators, Ed Markey, was a member of Congress. And before that, he was a rep, right? So these folks move through elected office. And the reason I bring this up is it oftentimes can seem like, oh, it doesn't matter who my city councilors are if I'm really focused on state spending. But more than likely, those city councilors will eventually move into other positions. Another example, the current chair of tourism, arts, and culture on the Senate side in Massachusetts is State Senator Ed Kennedy. And before he was a state senator, he was a city councilor in Lowell. So he understands very clearly how important arts and culture were to the reinvention and revitalization of Lowell. And it's one of the reasons he's so passionate about those issues now that he's in the state Senate. So building relationships with all of those folks along the way makes a huge difference. And then, how do you know who your elected officials are? So one of the things I sure do love is our Secretary of State's website, because they have this great little link that is called Where Do I Vote, MA? And regardless if you're registered to vote, you can put in an address that's a residential address, and it will tell you not only where you go vote on an election day, but literally all of your elected officials for that location, right? Because different cities have wards with specific city councilors. State reps have certain districts that overlap with some of the state senators. So knowing all of that, this is a great tool to do that. And I would suggest, I think we may have talked about it last week, like looking up those folks and make sure you're signed up for their newsletters. You have, signed up, if you're on social media, you've signed up for their Twitter accounts, because that's a great first way to understand better what their passions are, what their priority issues are. And then the other piece is, when you're thinking about building relationships, this moves me to my next slide, think about not having the first time you ask a elected official or decision maker for some, where the first time you reach out, having it be something that you have to ask them for. So introduce yourself, introduce your organization, share updates, right? We're all in the midst of various phases of reopening. There's not only a lot of anxiety around that, but there's also a lot of joy. I got an email today from a small music venue in Arlington that was just telling me that their shuttered venue operator grant award had been made, and it's the amount that they needed. And that was a great, they were just saying, like, here's some good news. I told Leland to tell his congressperson, right? And tell his state legislators, like, this is some good news, and I just wanted to share it with you. And we've already lined up, and we're ready to open, and we've got some great acts coming. We're excited to bring people back into public spaces and have them connect with each other, right? You could also invite them to programs. You could invite them to a tour of your art studio space. In fact, I know of a couple of state legislatures who, after an advocate reached out to them with a concern, literally said, can I come to your studio and talk to you more about this issue? And that artist took that as an opportunity to tour them around their space, tell them a little bit more about their creative practice, and really forge a relationship. And then make them aware of initiatives you're a part of, right? Like, I endorse this policy platform. I think it's a really important thing that we take a look at, right? Or I'm part of our downtown revitalization effort, and I'm really excited that we got to do this project where we were connecting young people to art making to community, right? These are all non-ask ways to forge relationships. At the end of the day, and I think we talked about this last time, elected officials really care about a couple of things. They care about doing good, right? Like, they got into their jobs because they wanted to affect policy and they wanted to make an impact on their communities. They also care about their voters, right? They care about their constituents because those are their bosses, and that's the way they get reelected. So if a legislator is not paying attention to their constituents can band together and vote for somebody else. So they want to be really responsive, okay? And then they also pay attention to their colleagues and their peers. That goes back to the thing we talked about in terms of when a bill gets filed, it's so important to get a lot of co-sponsors because that signals support. And if I see that a lot of my colleagues in the state Senate have signed on to this, I think, man, maybe I should too. This is an important piece of legislation. I'm going to co-sponsor it as well after I've reviewed it and heard from my constituents. I understand it's an important piece, right? So these things all matter, and starting to figure out what are the issues, what are the connection points that a decision maker has, and how you can help them understand your issues better through your personal public narrative, through the narrative of your organization and its impact on the community that they care about, helps move us forward. And nothing that I just talked about in that little bit of time has anything to do with lobbying. That is all advocacy. And you, as an arts and cultural leader or within your organization, have every right to do that educational advocacy work. So with that said, we are right at time, but I want to hold and see if there are any questions. This is your chance. This is not your only chance, but it's certainly a chance. And if you have a question, I suspect someone else on this call might have a similar question.
Hey, Emily, as folks are thinking about their questions, I have a question for you, if you don't mind.
I'd love your question. Yes, Michael.
You're super connected to a lot of legislators, and obviously the conversations with COVID and all the restrictions that we've got. You talked about that already. Just in those circles, what is out there right now? What is the feeling about the cultural community and COVID? Do our legislators understand the need that we're all presented when it comes to reopening? These big dollars are great. Not all of them have actually, materialized to us yet. And as folks are figuring out, we got the PPP and we have this fundraising, there's a limit to that. So as we reopen, we're trying to figure out how to spend those funds and hire folks. And it's really hard to hire folks right now. So what's the conversation, or what's the general vibe out there?
Well, that's a great question. So Michael, I think that in terms of our state legislature, through the work of the Mass Cultural Council and that data collection, we were incredibly effective in helping a lot of members of the state legislature, including leadership, understand just how serious the impact of the necessary public health closures of our creative spaces were, and what that meant not only to the sustainability of organizations, but to the literal people who count on those jobs, right? And so I think as evidenced of that, for the first time, I think ever, the House in their budget proposal didn't level fund or cut funding to the Mass Cultural Council, which is the major driver of public support for arts and culture in Massachusetts, right? Like that to me is like a very clear signal that we've been successful in that messaging. And that's not about Emily calling up legislators. It's literally about the data that was collected, the number of people who reached out and shared their personal stories about what's going on. So I think they're well aware. But this piece about like, what does reopening mean? I think there's some more education that needs to be done. And the things you're tapping into, which is like, it's really hard to get people back to work for a number of reasons, right? Most arts and cultural organizations and businesses can't just like switch on a light and open the doors and say we're open. For a lot of them, there's a ramp up period. And so that's going to take time, and it's going to need sustained support. And so right now, that's really what we're focused on, is like making sure that legislators understand just how much that sustained support is necessary. And then I think your other point, Michael, which is, the shuttered venue operators grant got a lot of press, and that was a big number, and that's great. But, as some of the people on this chat have pointed out, like not everybody in the creative sector is part of a venue or a performing arts organization. There are a lot of independent artists and visual artists and museums and historical spaces that are not eligible for that large piece of money. So that's a gap. Right? Not everybody was eligible for PPP. There are all of these exceptions. And, one of the things that we're really trying to talk a lot about, and this is the story that we're trying to tell, is that it's not about one or two arts and cultural organizations or artists remaining whole during this whole period of crisis. It's about our entire ecosystem surviving into thriving, right? So how do we make sure that we're opening in a stronger, more resilient way? Which is what many of the courses you've curated for during this session have been about. And I think that there's need for telling that story. So that's a great opportunity. It's not about saying like, hey, Senator, Smith, I need you to do this for me, but it's like, I want to just give you an update. Yes, like I got 2 PPP loans, and that really helped me from having to like eliminate my entire staff. But now I'm trying to reopen and I need to hire more people, and it's taking some time to hire new people and to train them up. So, I just want to let you know, I want to give you that update. You're not even talking about a piece of legislation. You're just sharing more information to educate them on the realities of what you're going through.
And I think that's a great point. A lot of folks, we work with our grantees in our community about advocacy. Part of it is a grant requirement, but also understanding the timing of the advocacy. A lot of activity happens when a bill comes out or when there's an override or there's all that action. But a lot of the folks that we talk to said it's very busy during that time, and it's hard to listen to because it's not just us, it's a lot of other things. It's sometimes the down period. So like the October, November, December, when we're not onto the next budget year and the previous one has ended, that's the time that a lot of folks get into their representatives, because there's not as much stuff. There's always stuff going on, but there's not as much as it is during those budget seasons. So the timing of those messaging is also important.
That is a really, really excellent point, Michael. The other thing to know is that decision makers and elected officials, they want to know what's going on in their communities, and they want to be in their communities. Almost, the way that the legislature schedule is set up, it's set up so that legislators have in-district days, right? And that's an opportunity for them to take meetings, to tour spaces. They want to do that. And so, as you pointed out, sometimes, particularly in the month of July, they're like, I'm sorry, we cannot do any meetings, but we're trying to finish up a budget. But in the fall, yeah, take them for a tour, give them an update, take them through the tour of your reopened space. Can you imagine what would happen if every legislator got an invite to tour a reopened space and to show them what it looks like to reopen a cultural and creative space?
Yeah, and I would say to everyone here too, one of the services that Mass Cultural Council does is whenever we have our annual grant cycles, we always reach out proactively to every representative and every senator to tell them about the organizations and artists and the communities, the LCCs, that are receiving funding in their area. So we take care of that. We already messaged that. Beth Ann Steiner, which a lot of you may know, our communications director, always send grants reports. So they've got the data, we take care of that. And it's these real stories that really accentuate, that really make it personal.
Oh my gosh, Michael, that is such a great example of data married with story, right? So that report that that Beth Ann sends, we also rely on it too. We find it to be extremely helpful, and it literally breaks down all the money going into a legislator's district. But if that's just a list of sort of anonymous money, and they don't sort of know the connection or understand that artist studio space that just got a festival grant, brings in tons of residents, and it's an extremely valued experience for everyone in their district, they're not going to kind of make that connection. So that's a story piece that is so important.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's about time. I didn't see any other questions come up, and I just want to be sensitive. I know it's already 4:16 here. So thank you to Emily and G for providing some wonderful resources for everybody. And thank you all for attending our webinar today. As I said before, this is the final one, so I can't even pitch a webinar for the rest of this week or next week. There are no more. We're going to take the summer off and kind of sink in everything that we've captured this whole spring. And we'll of course be back with additional materials next year. But thank you, Emily and G, and those of you who are on, if you haven't registered for Mass Creative on their website, their advocacy and action alerts. I send everybody who emails me. So what's going on? Go to Mass Creative. They're the first people to send it out. Follow them on Twitter. Follow them on Instagram and all the different places that they're very active, all on the social media. And so whenever there's an alert, yes, absolutely. Whenever there's an alert, I follow them and write on it. So thank you for the two of you, and thank you for everyone on the call. And we'll see you pretty soon. Take care.
Have a wonderful evening, all. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.